The medical station orbited the contested planet of Xerion Prime like a broken tooth against the starfield, its hull scarred by plasma burns and micrometeor impacts. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the observation window of the trauma bay, watching the latest wave of evacuation shuttles dock with the station. The Galactic Medical Corps had established this facility in neutral space, supposedly protected by ancient treaties that even the most warlike species respected. Supposedly. The war between the Cathara Empire and the Zelani Federation had been raging for 3 standard years now, and Sarah had seen enough broken bodies from both sides to know that neutrality was just a word on documents. The real universe was messier, bloodier, and far less concerned with medical ethics than the textbook suggested. She turned away from the window as another alarm chimed through the station. The triage bay was filling up again, and the other nurses moved with practiced efficiency through the chaos. Sarah had been stationed here for 18 months, longer than most human medical staff. The Galactic Medical Corps rotated personnel frequently to prevent what they called emotional contamination, the dangerous tendency to actually care about individual patients rather than viewing them as statistical entries in treatment logs. The main treatment floor buzzed with activity as wounded soldiers from both sides were processed through the intake systems. The Cathara wounded went to the left wing, their insectoid bodies requiring specialized equipment for their chitinous exterior and complex respiratory systems. The Zelani injured were directed to the right wing, where the medical staff dealt with their crystalline bone structures and silicon-based metabolisms. Sarah moved between both sections, one of the few medical personnel qualified to work with multiple species. Her xenobiology training had been extensive, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of treating soldiers who would gladly kill each other if they weren't too injured to move. The Cathara barely acknowledged medical staff, their compound eyes reflecting an alien stoicism that unnerved many human nurses. They bore pain in silence and followed treatment protocols without question, as if injury were simply another military objective to be overcome through discipline. The Zelani were different, but equally challenging. Their crystalline structure made pain readings difficult, and their method of communication involved harmonic frequencies that most humans couldn't interpret properly. They tolerated treatment but seemed to view medical intervention as a necessary weakness, something to be endured rather than appreciated. Between the two species, there was no communication, no acknowledgement of shared suffering. When Cathara and Zelani wounded ended up in the same recovery areas, they maintained absolute silence, turning away from each other with expressions that somehow managed to convey contempt across vastly different biological architectures. Dr. Vexhai, the station's Altari chief medical officer, had explained it to Sarah during her first week. These species have been enemies for generations before this current conflict. Their hatred runs deeper than politics or territory. It is cultural, genetic, almost spiritual in its intensity. We treat them, we save them, and they return to killing each other. This is the way of things. The Altari themselves maintained strict neutrality through what Sarah had come to recognize as calculated indifference. They were excellent doctors, precise and knowledgeable, but they treated patients like complex biological puzzles rather than sentient beings. It was efficient, she supposed, but it felt wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. Sarah was finishing her shift when the emergency klaxons began wailing through the station. The long, undulating tone meant incoming casualties, priority level critical. She checked the assignment board and saw her name listed for emergency triage duty. So much for getting some sleep. The first wave of wounded arrived on a damaged Zelani medical transport. The pilot managed to dock despite significant hull damage, and Sarah could see the desperation in the crew's movements as they unloaded their cargo. 12 Zelani soldiers, their crystalline forms darkened with whatever passed for blood in their silicon-based physiology. As the Zelani medical staff transferred their wounded to station gurneys, Sarah noticed something odd. The transport had 13 docking clamps activated, but only 12 patients were being transferred. She mentioned it to Dr. Vexhai, who checked his manifest data. The transport launched from the surface with 13 wounded, he confirmed. Perhaps one expired en route. The Zalani often jettison their dead to reduce weight and prevent infection spread. But something nagged at Sarah's mind as she worked through the evening shift. The Zalani medical crew had seemed agitated beyond normal battle stress, and she'd caught fragments of their harmonic communication that suggested confusion or disagreement about something. 3 hours after the transport docked, Sarah was taking her break in the station's small observation lounge when she noticed the red light on docking bay 7. Active docking clamps, but no logged arrivals. She pulled up the bay's security feed on her tablet and saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure was crawling across the docking bay floor, leaving a trail of dark fluid behind. Even through the grainy security feed, Sarah could see the distinctive chitinous armor and segmented limbs of a Cathara soldier. But this was the Zalani medical transport's docking bay. Understanding hit her like a plasma bolt. The 13th wounded aboard the Zalani transport hadn't been Zalani at all. It had been a Cathara soldier, probably captured or found unconscious in the battle zone. Rather than treat an enemy, the Zalani medical crew had simply dumped him in the docking bay and sealed the airlock. They'd left him to die alone in an empty metal chamber. Sarah looked around the observation lounge. 2 Altari medical technicians were discussing protein synthesis protocols. A human engineer was reading something on his tablet. None of them had noticed the security feed, and none of them would care if they had. It wasn't their problem. The wounded Cathara wasn't their patient, wasn't their responsibility. She thought about Dr. Vexhai's words about the way things worked. Species hated other species, soldiers killed other soldiers, and medical personnel maintained professional distance from individual suffering. It was efficient. It was logical. It was the way the galaxy functioned. Sarah stood up and walked toward the medical supply lockers. Docking Bay 7 was cold and filled with the mechanical hum of life support systems cycling air through the vast space. Sarah entered through the maintenance corridor, her portable medical kit slung over her shoulder and a small anti-gravity gurney floating behind her. The Cathara soldier had managed to crawl almost 50 meters from where the Zalani had dumped him. His chitinous carapace was cracked along his left side, leaking the yellowish fluid that served as blood for his species. One of his 4 arms hung at an unnatural angle, and his breathing apparatus was making a wet, clicking sound that Sarah recognized as a sign of respiratory distress. As she approached, his compound eyes tracked her movement. She could see intelligence there, awareness, and something she hadn't expected to recognize across species barriers. Fear. Not fear of death, but fear of further cruelty, of being abandoned again to suffer alone. Sarah knelt beside him and opened her medical kit. The universal translator clipped to her uniform, produced the clicking and chittering sounds that approximated Cathara language. "I am medical personnel. I want to help you." The soldier's response was weak but clear through the translator. "Human, why?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Why help an enemy? Why risk her career by violating protocols? Why care about one individual in a war that had claimed millions of lives? Sarah attached a bioscanner to the least damaged section of his carapace and began reading his vital signs. Internal bleeding, respiratory infection, possible neurological damage from head trauma. Serious, but treatable if she worked quickly. "Because you're hurt," she said, activating the anti-gravity gurney and carefully maneuvering it beside him. "And no one else will." Getting him onto the gurney without causing additional damage required careful coordination. Cathara anatomy was complex, with their 4-armed structure and segmented torso creating unique challenges for medical transport. Sarah had to reference her xenobiology training to find the proper support points for his injured form. As she worked, the soldier remained conscious but silent. His compound eyes followed her movements, and she could see him trying to understand her motivations. In his experience, enemies didn't heal each other. They captured, interrogated, and executed. They didn't gently position anti-gravity supports to prevent additional spinal damage. Sarah activated the gurney's medical field, a low-level energy barrier that would help stabilize his condition during transport. The Cathara's breathing apparatus stopped clicking quite so wetly, and some of the yellow fluid leaking from his carapace began to coagulate. "Can you tell me your name?" Sarah asked as they moved through the maintenance corridor toward the medical bay. "Zekthara, 9th Tactical Division." His voice was stronger now, though still filtered through the mechanical translation. "I should not tell you this information. I'm not interrogating you. I'm just trying to talk to you." A pause. "I do not understand the difference." Sarah realized she was about to walk into a political nightmare. Bringing an enemy soldier into the medical bay would require explanations she wasn't sure she could give. Dr. Vex-High would be furious. The Zalani medical staff would be outraged. The station's military liaisons would probably demand a full investigation. But as she looked down at Zekthara's injured form on the gurney, Sarah found that she didn't care about the complications. Someone had to care about individual lives, even if it wasn't efficient or logical or consistent with how the galaxy supposedly worked. She entered the medical bay through the emergency access port, bypassing the main triage area. The night shift was lighter, with only 2 other medical personnel on duty. Sarah could set up Zekthara in one of the isolation rooms and begin treatment before anyone noticed. The isolation room was designed for patients with communicable diseases, but it would serve her purposes. Sarah transferred Zekthara to a proper medical bed and began connecting him to the monitoring systems. His vital signs appeared on the holographic display, and Sarah felt a small surge of professional satisfaction as the numbers began stabilizing. "Why do you do this?" Zekthara asked again. "Your species gains nothing from my survival." Sarah considered the question as she prepared an IV solution compatible with Cathara biochemistry. Why was she doing this? It wasn't just medical training or professional ethics. Those could be rationalized away easily enough in a war zone. "Because leaving someone to die alone is wrong," she said finally. "Not strategically wrong or politically wrong. Just wrong." Zekthara was quiet for a long moment. "This concept of wrong, it exists independent of tactical advantage?" "Yes. I do not understand this, but I think I want to understand." Sarah attached the IV line and began the first round of treatment protocols. It would be a long night, and she wasn't sure what would happen when the day shift discovered what she'd done. But as she watched Zekthara's vital signs strengthen and stabilize, she knew she'd made the right choice. The galaxy might run on logic, efficiency, and calculated indifference. But sometimes one person had to be willing to step outside that system and remember that compassion wasn't a weakness to be overcome. Sometimes it was the only thing that made survival worthwhile. Outside the isolation room, the medical station continued its work, processing wounded soldiers from both sides of an ancient conflict. But in one small room, a human nurse worked through the night to save an enemy soldier's life, and neither of them fully understood yet how that single act of kindness would eventually change everything. Sarah woke to the sound of alarms and angry voices outside the isolation room. She'd managed 3 hours of sleep in the chair beside Zekthara's bed, and her neck ached from the awkward position. The Cathara soldier was conscious, his compound eyes tracking the commotion visible through the room's transparent aluminum window. Dr. Vex-High stood in the corridor with 2 Zalani officers. their crystalline forms vibrating with harmonic frequencies that Sarah's translator couldn't quite process but clearly indicated extreme agitation. Behind them, Station Commander Racetalk, an imposing Altari with silver-scaled skin and cold reptilian eyes, reviewed data on his personal tablet. "They know I am here," Zekthara observed quietly. "You will be punished for this action." Sarah checked his vitals on the medical display. Much improved overnight, though he'd need several more days of treatment to fully recover. "Maybe, but you're alive. I begin to understand this makes a difference to humans." The door to the isolation room hissed open, and Dr. Vexhai entered with the delegation. His usually composed Altari features showed signs of stress, the scaled ridges above his eyes darker than usual. "Nurse Chen," he said, his voice carrying the precise, emotionless tone that all Altari used when displeased. "Please explain why you have an enemy combatant in our medical facility without proper authorization, documentation, or security protocols." Sarah stood, acutely aware that she was about to defend something that sounded indefensible when stated so clinically. "I found him dying in Docking Bay 7. He needed medical attention." Commander Racetalk stepped forward, his larger frame casting Sarah in shadow. "The Zalani medical staff followed proper protocols. Enemy wounded are to be isolated and reported to military authorities for interrogation. They are not to be treated as regular patients." "He was left to die," Sarah said, her voice carrying more steel than she'd intended. "That's not a protocol. That's murder." The Zalani officers erupted in harmonic frequencies so sharp they triggered safety alarms on the room's audio systems. Dr. Vexahai raised one scaled hand for silence. "Nurse Chen, you are displaying emotional contamination that compromises your professional judgment. The Zalani acted within established military guidelines. Enemy wounded who cannot be properly processed are routinely disposed of to prevent security breaches and resource waste." Sarah looked from Dr. Vexhai to the Zalani officers to Commander Racetalk, seeing the same expression on all their faces despite their vastly different biology. They were looking at her like she'd done something incomprehensibly stupid. "Resource waste?" Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. "He's a sentient being, not a damaged piece of equipment." "He is an enemy soldier," Commander Racetalk corrected. "His survival potentially aids hostile forces and consumes medical resources that could be used for allied personnel. Your emotional response prevents you from seeing the logical calculation." Zekthara had been silent during this exchange, but now he spoke, his mechanical translator producing clear galactic standard. "The human nurse saved my life when my enemies left me to die. I wish to understand why." One of the Zalani officers turned toward Zekthara, their crystalline form shifting color to a darker hue that Sarah recognized as a threat display. The harmonic frequencies they produced needed no translation. Pure hatred made audible. "You understand nothing, insectoid. You are a weapon that has temporarily ceased functioning. The human's primitive emotions prevent her from disposing of you properly." Sarah stepped between the Zalani officer and Zekthara's bed without thinking. "Get away from my patient." The room fell silent except for the steady hum of medical equipment. Dr. Vexhai's scaled features showed something that might have been surprise. Commander Racetalk's reptilian eyes narrowed. "Your patient?" Dr. Vexhai asked slowly. "Nurse Chen, you are not assigned to treat enemy combatants. You have no authority to claim medical responsibility for this individual." "Then I'm claiming it now," Sarah said. "Under Galactic Medical Corps regulations, any patient who receives treatment becomes the responsibility of the attending medical professional until properly transferred or discharged." Dr. Vexhai consulted his tablet, his clawed fingers moving rapidly across the display. After a moment, his expression darkened further. The regulation exists, but it was written for civilian emergency situations, not military prisoners. It doesn't specify, Sarah pointed out. A patient is a patient. Commander Racetalk stepped closer to Sarah, his larger form looming over her. Human, your species' reputation for emotional irrationality is well documented, but this exceeds normal parameters. You risk your career, your station assignment, and potentially your life to preserve an enemy who would kill you without hesitation, given the opportunity. Sarah glanced back at Zekthara, who was listening to this exchange with apparent fascination. Would you? Kill me without hesitation? The Kithara soldier considered the question seriously. 3 days ago, yes. My training, my culture, my genetic conditioning all indicated that humans are enemies to be eliminated. But you... He paused, his compound eyes reflecting the room's medical lighting. You have damaged this conditioning. I find I cannot logically justify harming someone who preserved my life when logic dictated abandonment. The Zilani officers' harmonic frequencies became even more agitated. One of them addressed Commander Racetalk directly. This contamination spreads. The insectoid is being corrupted by human emotional dysfunction. We should terminate both the prisoner and the nurse to prevent further spread of this behavioral anomaly. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but Dr. Vexhai raised his hand again. The Galactic Medical Corps maintains authority over all medical personnel and facilities. The Zilani may request prisoner transfer, but they cannot demand termination of medical staff. Yet, Commander Racetalk added quietly, Nurse Chen, you will complete this patient's treatment within 72 hours. After that, he will be transferred to military custody for proper processing. Your actions will be reviewed by the Medical Corps Disciplinary Board. After the delegation left, Sarah sat heavily in her chair beside Zekthara's bed. The Kithara soldier watched her with apparent concern, an expression she wouldn't have thought possible on his insectoid features. You have risked much for someone you do not know, he observed. Your leaders are displeased. Your career may be damaged. I do not understand why humans make such calculations. Sarah managed a tired smile. We don't always make calculations. Sometimes we just do what feels right. This concept of feeling right, it overrides logical analysis. Sometimes, when the logical analysis leads to leaving someone to die alone, yes. Zekthara was quiet for several minutes, his breathing apparatus cycling with steady mechanical rhythm. In Kithara culture, individual survival is subordinated to collective benefit. We do not save enemies because their survival potentially harms the collective. Your action makes no sense within this framework. What if the framework is wrong? Another long pause. I have never considered this possibility. Frameworks are established through centuries of testing and refinement. They represent optimal survival strategies. Sarah checked his IV line and adjusted the medication flow. Maybe optimal survival isn't the only thing that matters. Maybe there's something to be said for optimal living. Over the next 2 days, Sarah found herself spending most of her off-duty time in the isolation room. Zekthara proved to be remarkably intelligent and curious about human psychology and culture. Their conversations ranged from technical discussions about interspecies medicine to philosophical debates about the nature of morality and duty. Your species confuses me, Zekthara admitted during one of these talks. You create weapons capable of destroying planets, yet you also create music and art that serves no tactical purpose. You wage war with devastating efficiency, yet you risk yourselves to save enemies. These behaviors seem contradictory. Maybe that's what makes us human, Sarah suggested. We're contradictory. We don't always make sense, even to ourselves. But how do you function as a society with such contradictions? Sarah considered this. I think it's because we argue with ourselves a lot. We debate what's right and what's wrong, what's worth fighting for, and what's worth protecting. We don't all agree, but we keep trying to figure it out. The Kythera have solved this problem through genetic conditioning and social programming. We know our roles, our duties, our purposes. There is no confusion. But there's no growth either, Sarah pointed out. No chance to become something better than what you were designed to be. On the morning of the third day, Dr. Vexahai entered with a security detail and transfer authorization. Zekthara was medically stable and ready for military processing. Sarah had known this moment was coming, but she still felt a hollow sensation in her stomach as she watched the guards prepare restraints. "Nurse Chen," Zekthara said as the guards attached binding devices to his forearms, "I want you to know that I understand now why you saved me. It was not tactical calculation or emotional dysfunction. It was recognition of something fundamental that my species has forgotten." "What's that?" "That individual lives have value beyond their utility to larger systems. That compassion is not weakness, but a form of strength. That choosing to preserve life, even enemy life, affirms something essential about the nature of existence itself." The guards began moving him toward the door, but Zekthara continued speaking. "I will remember this, and I will carry this understanding with me, wherever these guards take me." Sarah watched through the isolation room's window as they led Zekthara away. She'd expected to feel satisfaction at having saved his life, but instead, she felt empty, knowing he was walking toward interrogation, imprisonment, or execution. 2 hours later, alarms began wailing throughout the medical station. Emergency broadcasts announced that a Kythera battle group had penetrated the neutral zone and was approaching the medical facility. The station's defensive systems activated automatically, but everyone knew they were insufficient against a determined military assault. Sarah joined the other medical staff in the central corridor, watching tactical displays show the approaching ships. 6 Kythera cruisers in battle formation, moving with obvious hostile intent toward their supposedly protected medical facility. "They're going to destroy us," whispered Dr. Marquez, one of the human physicians. "The Kythera don't recognize medical neutrality when they're in full assault mode." Commander Reisestok's voice echoed through the station's communication system. "All personnel prepare for emergency evacuation. We have approximately 20 minutes before the attacking force enters weapons range." But as the medical staff began implementing evacuation protocols, something unexpected happened. The lead Kythera cruiser broke formation and transmitted a message on standard diplomatic frequencies. The holographic display in the main corridor activated, showing a Kythera officer in elaborate ceremonial armor. His compound eyes reflected the bridge lighting of his ship, and when he spoke, his words were transmitted in perfect galactic standard without mechanical translation. "I am Fleet Commander Thekvar of the 9th Tactical Division. We have come for our lost soldier, Zekthara. We understand he is aboard your medical facility. We request his immediate release." Sarah felt her breath catch. They'd come for him. An entire battle group had risked entering neutral space just to retrieve one wounded soldier. Commander Reistok responded from the station's command center. "Fleet Commander, your soldier has been processed according to standard military protocols. He is no longer aboard this facility." There was a pause. Then Zekthara's voice, somehow transmitted from the Kythera flagship, filled the medical station's corridors. "Commander Reistok, I am Zekthara. I am aboard the flagship, having been returned to my people through means I do not fully understand. But I wish to speak with the human nurse, Sarah Chen, before my fleet departs." Sarah found herself pushed forward by the other medical staff, all of them staring at her with expressions ranging from amazement to terror. Somehow, the wounded enemy soldier they'd been prepared to execute had not only escaped custody, but convinced an entire battle group to come for him. A communication station was activated, and Sarah found herself speaking directly to a Kithara fleet commander and the soldier she'd saved. Zekthara? How did you— The details are not important, Sarah Chen. What matters is this. I told my commanders about what you did for me, about how you chose to preserve my life when logic and military efficiency demanded my death. I explained the concept you taught me, that individual lives have value beyond their utility. Fleet Commander Tekvar's voice joined the communication. Nurse Chen, Zekthara's account of your actions has created significant discussion among our leadership. We wish to understand this concept you call compassion. We wish to understand how it can coexist with military effectiveness. Sarah realized she was speaking not just to one recovered soldier, but to an entire alien military fleet that had apparently come to learn about human nature. And somehow, everything that happened next would depend on how well she could explain why saving one enemy soldier had been worth risking everything. Sarah stood in the communications center, surrounded by medical staff and station officers, all watching her as if she held the key to preventing a catastrophic battle. 6 Kithara warships hung in space beyond the viewport, their weapons powered down but clearly ready for action. She was acutely aware that her next words might determine whether the medical station survived the next hour. Fleet Commander, Sarah began, her voice steadier than she felt. Compassion isn't something you can easily explain in tactical terms. It's about recognizing that every thinking being has inherent worth, regardless of which side they're fighting for. Tekvar's image on the holographic display tilted his head in a gesture Sarah was beginning to recognize as curiosity among the Kithara. But this conflicts with military efficiency. Resources spent preserving enemy lives cannot be used to protect Allied forces. That's true in the short term, Sarah admitted. But what about the long term? What happens when enemies stop being enemies? Enemies remain enemies until one side achieves total victory, Tekvar stated with absolute certainty. This is the fundamental principle of warfare. Zekthara's voice joined the conversation. Commander, I believed this principle until 3 days ago, but consider, the human nurse Sarah spent resources to preserve my life. By doing so, she has gained something of greater value than tactical advantage. Explain. She has gained my absolute loyalty, my respect, and my willingness to question assumptions that I had never examined. She has turned an enemy into someone who wishes to understand her species' perspective. Is this not a form of victory? Sarah could see Dr. Vexhai and Commander Rysatok exchanging glances. This wasn't how diplomatic or military encounters were supposed to proceed. There were protocols, established procedures, centuries of precedent for how different species interacted during wartime. Fleet Commander Tekvar was silent for several moments. Zekthara, you are suggesting that individual acts of compassion can fundamentally alter strategic relationships? I am suggesting something more radical than that, Commander. I am suggesting that compassion might be a more effective long-term strategy than warfare. The words hung in the space between the medical station and the Kithara fleet like a challenge to everything both sides understood about the nature of conflict. Commander Rysatok finally spoke up. This discussion is fascinating, but we have immediate concerns. Fleet Commander, your vessels are in violation of neutral space treaties. Regardless of your philosophical interests, your presence here threatens the medical station's protected status. Commander Rysatok, Tekvar replied, my fleet will remain in this position until we have completed our investigation of human medical practices and the psychological frameworks that support them. Sarah realized that what had started as a simple act of treating a wounded soldier had somehow evolved into a first contact scenario between species that had never directly communicated about anything other than military tactics and surrender terms. Fleet Commander, Sarah said, if you're truly interested in understanding human medical ethics, I'd like to propose something. Let me treat your wounded. The holographic display flickered as Thekvar's compound eyes reflected apparent surprise. You wish to provide medical treatment to Kithara personnel? Yes. You must have wounded from recent battles. Let me show you how human medical protocols work when we're treating allies instead of enemies you've captured. Dr. Vexhai stepped forward quickly. Nurse Chen, you don't have authorization to make such offers. The medical station operates under strict neutrality protocols. But Commander Reistok raised one scaled hand. Actually, Dr. Vexhai, Nurse Chen's proposal falls within established Medical Corps guidelines for humanitarian assistance. If the Kithara formally request medical aid, we are obligated to provide it. Thekvar consulted with someone off-screen. Their rapid clicking communication, untranslatable but clearly intense. Finally, he returned his attention to the communication link. We will transfer 12 wounded to your facility for treatment, but we will also send observers to monitor your procedures and question your medical staff about their motivations and methodologies. 2 hours later, Sarah found herself in the largest treatment bay, working alongside 3 other human nurses to process Cathara wounded, while a delegation of uninjured Cathara officers watched every procedure with microscopic attention. The wounded Cathara were different from Zekathara in several ways. These were front-line combat veterans, their carapaces scarred from multiple engagements, their movements economical and disciplined even while injured. But Sarah began to notice something as she worked. Each wounded soldier reacted with visible surprise when the human medical staff treated them with the same careful attention they would give to any patient. Sarah watched recognition dawn in compound eyes as pain medication took effect, as wounds were cleaned and dressed with gentle efficiency, as human hands worked to preserve Kithara lives with obvious dedication. One of the observing officers, introduced as Tactical Analyst Mortek, approached Sarah during a brief break between treatments. Nurse Chen, I wish to understand the calculations you used to determine resource allocation for enemy wounded. Sarah looked up from the medical supplies she was organizing. We don't use calculations for that. We just treat whoever needs treatment. But surely you prioritize based on strategic value. Rank, potential intelligence information, likelihood of successful treatment. We prioritize based on medical need, most critical cases first, regardless of who they are. Mortek's compound eyes reflected the treatment bay lighting as he processed this information. This seems inefficient. You could interrogate the wounded during treatment, extract valuable intelligence while they are vulnerable and dependent on your assistance. Sarah paused in her supply organization. That would violate medical ethics. Our job is to heal, not to exploit vulnerability. I do not understand this distinction. All actions should serve multiple strategic purposes. What if they don't, though? Sarah asked. What if sometimes an action is worth doing just because it's the right thing to do? Before Mortek could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the treatment bay. The tactical displays activated automatically, showing multiple ships dropping out of hyperspace near the medical station. Sarah recognized the crystalline hull configurations immediately. Zalani warships. Fleet Commander Thekvar's voice echoed through the station's communication system. Medical Station Zerion, be advised that a Zalani battle group has entered the area. We are moving to defensive positions. Commander Reistok's response came immediately. Both fleets are in violation of neutral space treaties. You are ordered to withdraw immediately. But instead of withdrawing, both fleets began maneuvering into combat formations around the medical station. Sarah realized with growing horror that she was about to witness a major space battle at point-blank range, with the medical facility caught directly in the middle. The Zalani fleet commander's image appeared on the holographic displays throughout the station. Sarah recognized the harmonic frequency patterns as expressions of extreme anger and outrage. Kithara vessels, you have violated neutral space to retrieve enemy wounded. This action demonstrates that the medical station has been compromised and can no longer claim protected status. Thekvar responded immediately. Zelani, Commander, we are here to understand human medical practices, not to conduct military operations. Our weapons are powered down and we pose no threat to the medical facility. Your presence here is a threat. We demand the immediate return of all Cathara personnel and the termination of medical staff who have aided enemy forces. Sarah felt ice in her stomach. The Zelani weren't just demanding military objectives. They were demanding her death and the deaths of anyone who had helped treat Cathara wounded. But then, Zekthara's voice joined the communication network, transmitted from the Cathara flagship. Zelani, Commander, I am the soldier who was found wounded in your medical transport. Your staff left me to die rather than provide basic medical care. The humans saved my life when my own enemies abandoned me. You are property of the Zelani military system. Your survival or death is irrelevant beyond its tactical implications. But it is not irrelevant to me, Zekthara replied, and it is not irrelevant to my people. We have learned something important about the value of individual life from the humans. Sarah watched the tactical displays as both fleets continued their careful dance around the medical station. Neither side wanted to fire first and risk destroying the facility, but neither side was backing down. Then Dr. Vexhi's voice came through the station's internal communication system. All medical personnel report to the main treatment bay immediately. We are implementing emergency protocols. Sarah and the other nurses quickly moved the Cathara wounded to the main medical area, where they found something unprecedented. Dr. Vexhi had ordered all patients, Cathara, Zelani, and the few other species currently receiving treatment, to be placed in the same area. What we are about to do, Dr. Vexhi announced, violates every protocol for treating enemy forces, but Nurse Chen has demonstrated that sometimes protocol must yield to principle. The Altari Chief Medical Officer activated the station's external communication system, addressing both fleets simultaneously. This is Dr. Vexhi, Chief Medical Officer of Medical Station Zerion. I am transmitting live feed from our main treatment bay. I want both fleet commanders to observe what is happening here. The holographic displays throughout the station now showed the treatment bay, where human medical staff worked alongside the few Altari and other species doctors to treat wounded from multiple factions. But more importantly, it showed the patients themselves. A wounded Zelani soldier was lying on a medical bed next to a Cathara veteran. Neither was armed, neither was threatening the other. They were simply two injured individuals receiving medical care in the same space. Sarah watched both fleet commanders' expressions change as they observed the scene. The wounded weren't maintaining the rigid hostility that characterized their species' interactions. They were talking. The conversation was being translated through the station's communication systems, and Sarah could hear a Zelani soldier asking a Cathara veteran about pain management techniques for carapace injuries. The Cathara was explaining respiratory therapy methods that might help with crystalline lung damage. They were sharing medical information. Enemies were helping each other understand their injuries and recovery processes. This is impossible, the Zelani fleet commander stated flatly. Our species cannot coexist in the same space without conflict. Yet they are doing so, Thekvar observed. Under human medical supervision, ancient enemies are cooperating for mutual benefit. Sarah realized that this was the moment everything could change. She activated her personal communication link to address both fleet commanders directly. Fleet commanders, what you're seeing isn't impossible. It's just what happens when you treat people as individuals instead of as representatives of enemy factions. When you focus on healing instead of hurting, on preserving life instead of ending it. But how do we scale this? Thekvar asked. How do we apply individual compassion to strategic planning and military operations? Maybe, Sarah suggested. You start by questioning whether every conflict needs to be resolved through military operations. Maybe you start by asking what both sides actually need, instead of focusing on what they're fighting over. The Zalani commander's harmonic frequencies shifted to patterns Sarah didn't recognize. After consulting with her xenobiology training, she realized she was hearing something unprecedented: uncertainty. The Zalani commander was actually considering the possibility that their fundamental assumptions about warfare might be incomplete. "Human nurse," the Zalani commander said finally, "your species has introduced variables into military calculations that we have never encountered. The concept that preserving enemy life can create strategic advantage challenges our basic understanding of conflict resolution." "Then maybe," Sarah replied, "it's time to develop new understandings." The standoff continued for another 4 hours, but gradually something extraordinary began to happen. Both fleets started rotating small groups of officers through the medical station to observe the treatment procedures. Cathara and Zalani military personnel found themselves in the same corridors, the same observation rooms, watching human medical staff treat their wounded with identical levels of care and attention. Sarah watched Morthek, the Cathara tactical analyst, standing beside a Zalani strategic planning officer as they observed a human surgeon treating a complex injury. They weren't talking to each other, but they weren't actively avoiding each other either. They were simply coexisting. Finally, Fleet Commander Thekvar requested a direct communication link with the Zalani commander. Sarah couldn't hear their conversation, but she watched both leaders' body language as they talked for over an hour. When they finished, Thekvar addressed the medical station. "Nurse Chen, your demonstration has created possibilities that neither the Cathara nor the Zalani had previously considered. We are not ready to end our war today, but we are ready to establish protocols for medical neutrality that protect facilities like this one." The Zalani commander added her harmonic agreement. "We will also establish joint medical research initiatives to better understand how human medical ethics can be adapted for interspecies conflicts." As both fleets prepared to withdraw from the neutral zone, Zekathara requested one final private communication with Sarah. "Sarah Chen," he said, "you saved more than my life 3 days ago. You saved my species' ability to grow beyond what we thought we were capable of becoming. We will not forget this lesson." "What will you do now?" Sarah asked. "I will return to my duties as a soldier, but I will carry with me the understanding that enemies can become something other than enemies, if given the opportunity, and I will share this understanding with others." As the Cathara and Zalani fleets departed the system, Sarah stood in the observation lounge watching their ships disappear into hyperspace. Dr. Vexhai joined her at the viewport. "Nurse Chen," he said, "you have fundamentally altered how two species view the concepts of warfare and medical neutrality. The ripple effects of your actions will continue for generations." "I just didn't want to leave someone to die alone," Sarah replied. "Yes," Dr. Vexhai agreed. "And that simple refusal to abandon a wounded enemy has just changed the trajectory of an interstellar war." 6 months later, Sarah received a message from the newly established Joint Medical Ethics Commission, a cooperative organization founded by former enemies to study human approaches to medical care during conflicts. The message was signed by representatives from 17 different species, including Cathara Fleet Commander Thekvar and former Zalani battle strategist Morvek Hai. The message was simple: "Thank you for teaching us that preserving life is not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be cultivated." Sarah archived the message and returned to her duties on medical station Zarion. There were always wounded soldiers arriving, representatives of species that considered each other ancient enemies. But now, increasingly, Sarah noticed that the rigid barriers between hostile factions were beginning to soften. Individual acts of compassion, it turned out, were contagious in ways that military strategists had never calculated. And sometimes one person's willingness to save a single life could change the entire galaxy's understanding of what was possible.